Okay, we're going through this book, The Holy Grail of Wisdom Quotes, in alphabetical order. We're on Socrates. So this is a famous painting of Socrates. The death of Socrates. The painter's name is Jacques Louis David. Okay, from 1787. And Socrates is taking the hemlock. He's just agreed to accept the ruling of the Athenian politicos. There's Plato, very sad because he thinks Socrates is the best man in all of Athens, yet he's been condemned to die. Okay, they tried to, make a deal with the guards that he could escape and be exiled, but he turned it down. Okay, so Socrates is sort of seen like the saint of philosophy, the martyr of philosophy. And he's also seen as sort of like a proto-Christian. He was sort of said a lot of things implying he believed in one God. And you'll hear a lot of people say, like Nietzsche, that, Christianity is Platonism for the masses. And it's a lot like Socrates in many ways as well. More like Socrates, I think, than Plato. Okay, Plato was in favor of eugenics. Plato was in favor of the big lie, lying to the population. He said people are too stupid, you can't tell them the truth. You have to just tell them lies that make them behave well. Okay, and he wrote the allegory of Plato's cave, of course. Okay, so Erasmus used to say, "Pray for us, Saint Socrates." And Athens, was the big site of the development of philosophy, the beginning of books and an academic mindset. It's really the birthplace of Western literature, all the plays, Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides. Socrates himself had been accused of disrespecting the gods and corrupting the youth. And Aristophanes had made a play about him years earlier, The Clouds, showing how Socrates would corrupt the youth in his opinion. Plato, on the other hand, was a guy who became most famous for his philosophy, but he had at one time wanted to be a politician, at one time he'd wanted to be a playwright and to write a tragedy. He failed at these things, but the death of Socrates gave him a magnificent subject for tragedy. And he wrote about it rather extensively. And his early works about Socrates were probably the real Socrates, but later on it's thought he started to use Socrates, almost the dead Socrates, as his own philosophical mouthpiece, if you will. And you can see it in some ways a little bit like the tragedy of Prometheus or the tragedy of Christ. The idea of the best man suffers the most unfair, cruel punishment. Okay? So anyways, Plato himself did a good job of making sure his works would survive, and most of them did, versus Aristotle, who was sort of a visitor to Athens, a Macedonian. We only have about 20-25% of his works, unfortunately. So the Plato school was called the Academy. Aristotle came back to Athens later after having tutored Alexander the Great, and his school became called the Lyceum, and then walking around teaching students was called the Peripatetics. Okay, anyways, a couple things getting back to Greece and Socrates. So Greek had historically been very proud of its physical machismo and strength and excellence in war, and they had to be. If they weren't really great fighters, they would have lost to the Persians and they would have been all made into slaves. There would be no history of Western philosophy if the Persians had defeated the Greeks, in the Persian War, the early 400s. Okay. Socrates used to, this is a guy who wrote this book, Anthony Gottlieb. He's kind of a philosopher guy. The name of his book was called The Dream of Reason. And he would talk about how Socrates was a little bit of a hypocrite. He would sort of badger people with questions and use a little bit of sophistry himself, that he would accuse other people of being sophistic. So there's a little bit of hypocrisy there. And Socrates brought up the point. He said that if you worship multiple gods and the gods don't agree on something, then how do you know what is right? How do you know what is morally right? And this is part of the thing about him being thought to have disrespected the gods. And he says, are you not, instead of worshiping the good, are you just worshiping the powerful? Plato himself totally admired Socrates, felt he was definitely the best man in Athens. Okay. Let's see here. Socrates called himself the gadfly, and that was sort of a joke about Bellerophon, who'd been bumped off his horse Pegasus. When he tried to ride to Olympus, Zeus sent the gadfly to bother the horse, and then he bucked him off. Let's see. Oh, Nietzsche didn't really like Socrates that much. He felt that Socrates was kind of wimpifying the Athenians. He liked him better. He was sort of more Dionysian, if you will, the god of partying, Bacchus and wine, rather than Apollonian, the god of reason, if you will. And so he felt that Socrates and Plato were kind of pussifying the Greeks, and he didn't like them. But Nietzsche was crazy, you know. Napoleon was his hero, sort of like Bismarck, sort of his hero. Very militaristic, anti-Christian, and he himself was a total screw-up. Okay, Thomas Macaulay, the English historian, he wrote, "The more I read about Socrates, the less I wonder why they poisoned him." Okay, I like Socrates, and he did a good job with his Socratic dialogue of questioning to work to the truth. So I think that is useful, but I do think he's a little bit of a hypocrite. He was kind of doing stuff that he'd accused the sophists of doing. Same with Plato. Alcibiades said, "Socrates is a magician with words." Cicero, who had been trained by Greek tutors and spent a lot of time going back to ancient Greece and translating the Greek books into Roman, into Latin, he said, "Socrates is the wisest and most upright of all men." Edward de Bono, the Rhodes Scholar, creative thinker guy, said that the Socratic method of questioning is good for refuting heretics, but it is not good for creative thinking. Okay. Yeah, there's sort of a different sort of thinking to question to get down to the truth of a known event rather than to think creatively. You got to think differently. I heard some guy say if you want to think different, then you got to read different. You got to read things no one else reads, and I think there's some truth in that. The weakness of Socrates was his naive view of human nature and his hypocrisy towards the sophists whose methods he copied. That's sort of, oh, here's Anthony Gottlieb saying that. A Socratic dialogue is a cooperative conversation between two persons who seek the truth. Socrates believed that understanding the virtues was a prerequisite to acquiring them. Yeah, and it almost seemed a little bit ridiculous that virtue is the key to happiness. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think pursuing a good goal and working to make progress toward it, that makes you happy, but being virtuistic doesn't always make you happy. It means you piss off a lot of people and then they're not nice to you. You might be glad you have virtue, but you're going to pay a price for it too. Cicero, Socrates had called philosophy down from the heavens and made it useful to the common man. Talked about things that people care about rather than some of the esoteric stuff. Some of these other early Greek philosophers were talking about, like, what is matter made out of and things like that. Okay, quote from Socrates, "The highest form of human excellence is to question oneself and others. The fastest path to glory is to strive to become what you wish to be." Okay, a little bit like saying, be your best self, do what you really want to do, and then you'll progress faster. The real question is, can you get paid for that? Socrates, "The unexamined life is not worth living. Go wherever the facts lead." So I like the fact that he's trying to pursue the truth. So anyways, that's our intro, part one of Socrates. I'm just going to probably do it in 2 parts, so I hope you found this helpful.